When my husband told our daughter that her college fund was temporarily unavailable because of market fluctuations, I believed him. When she discovered he had actually stolen $127,000 to fund his gambling addiction, she didn't just expose him, she systematically dismantled his entire financial life with the precision of a forensic accountant. Sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and sometimes that's exactly what a lying father deserves. Before we dive back in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story hit home, hit that subscribe button. I've got something really special lined up for tomorrow. I'm Rachel Montgomery, and for 22 years, I believed I had married a man of integrity. My husband, Trevor, worked as a senior loan officer at Pinnacle Community Bank in Westfield, Oregon, a position that commanded respect in our small town of 15,000 residents. His daily routine of pressed shirts, leather briefcase, and confident handshake with local business owners painted the picture of financial responsibility that I had grown to depend upon. Our daughter Autumn was born when I was 25, and from her first breath, Trevor and I agreed that her education would be our top priority. We opened her college fund when she was 6 months old, and I remember the pride in Trevor's voice as he explained compound interest to our babbling infant, promising her that mathematics would secure her future. Every month for 17 and a half years, I watched Trevor make those deposits with religious dedication. The ritual became as predictable as mortgage payments. The first Saturday of each month, Trevor would drive to the bank, deposit my monthly contribution of $400 from my nursing salary at Westfield General Hospital, add his matching $400 from his banking income, and return home with a receipt that we would file in Autumn's baby book alongside her report cards and achievement certificates. The fund represented more than money. It symbolized our shared commitment to breaking the cycle of limited opportunities that had defined both our childhoods. Neither Trevor nor I had attended college. I had earned my nursing degree through community college and night classes while working full-time at a medical clinic. Trevor had worked his way up from bank teller to loan officer through 15 years of studying banking regulations and cultivating relationships with local business leaders. We wanted something different for Autumn. We wanted her to have choices. Trevor's expertise in banking and investments made him the natural manager of Autumn's college fund. He explained market fluctuations with the confidence of someone who spent 40 hours each week evaluating loan applications and investment portfolios. When the fund's balance seemed to grow more slowly than projected, he attributed it to economic downturns. When quarterly statements showed lower returns than expected, he discussed the volatility of educational savings plans with the authority of a financial professional. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? Trevor handled all our investment decisions, managed our mortgage refinancing, and consistently demonstrated the kind of financial acumen that had earned him promotions and respect within Pinnacle Community Bank. His colleagues frequently sought his advice about their own investment strategies. Local business owners specifically requested Trevor when applying for commercial loans because of his reputation for thorough analysis and fair evaluation. The signs I should have noticed were camouflaged by Trevor's professional credibility. When he started working late more frequently, staying at the office until 7 or 8 o'clock, he explained that loan applications had increased due to the improving local economy. Small business owners were expanding, families were purchasing homes, and agricultural operations were upgrading equipment. The additional hours meant additional income through loan origination fees and performance bonuses. When he began receiving phone calls that required private conversations in his home office, he mentioned that confidentiality requirements in banking sometimes necessitated discreet discussions about sensitive financial matters. Client privacy was paramount in his profession, and I respected his professional boundaries. When our own financial picture began showing subtle changes, delayed bill payments, requests to postpone vacation plans, suggestions that we skip expensive dinners out, Trevor explained these as temporary cash flow management strategies. His income came partially through quarterly bonuses tied to loan performance, creating natural fluctuations that required careful budgeting during leaner months. Every explanation made perfect sense. Trevor's professional expertise provided credible justification for every concerning pattern I observed. The man who processed million-dollar commercial loans for respected local businesses certainly understood how to manage our family's financial planning. Autumn had inherited my methodical nature and Trevor's analytical mind, but she had developed her own fierce independence that neither of us had anticipated. By her junior year at Westfield High School, she was maintaining a 4.2 GPA while working 15 hours per week at the local veterinary clinic, volunteering with the hospital's youth outreach program, and serving as treasurer of the National Honor Society. Her academic performance had attracted attention from college recruiters, and she had already received preliminary scholarship offers from Oregon State University for their pre-veterinary program. The scholarships would cover approximately 60% of her education costs, leaving roughly $15,000 annually that would need to be funded through our college savings plan. Autumn approached college planning with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything else in her life. She created detailed spreadsheets comparing program costs, scholarship opportunities, and career placement statistics. She researched housing options, meal plan expenses, and textbook costs with the precision of an accountant preparing audit documentation.
"Honey, you're making this much more complicated than necessary," he said, closing his laptop and attempting to redirect the conversation. "I've been managing investments for 15 years at the bank. I understand market fluctuations better than online calculators and theoretical projections." But Autumn had prepared for this deflection strategy. Her third spreadsheet contained data that would shatter Trevor's professional credibility claims in the most devastating way possible. "Dad, I called Pinnacle Community Bank yesterday and spoke with Mrs. Henderson in the Investment Services Department," Autumn said, her voice remaining steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I explained that I was researching college financing options and needed information about 529 plan performance for educational planning purposes." Trevor's professional composure finally cracked, and I watched 17 years of trust dissolve in real time as our daughter continued her methodical destruction of his carefully constructed lies. Mrs. Henderson was very helpful. She explained that Pinnacle Community Bank doesn't actually manage 529 educational savings plans. They partner with Vanguard and Fidelity for investment services, but all account management and statements come directly from those companies. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, knowing that devastating winds were about to tear apart everything you believed was solid and permanent. She also mentioned that employees in her department maintain detailed records of all investment accounts opened through bank partnerships. Autumn continued, consulting her notes with the precision of someone presenting evidence in a legal proceeding. "There is no 529 plan associated with our family name or social security numbers in their system." Trevor's face had gone from pale to gray, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for an explanation that would restore the foundation of our family's financial security and my husband's integrity. "Autumn, there are privacy regulations that prevent bank employees from discussing account details with unauthorized individuals, even family members," he said, grasping for any explanation that might deflect her investigation. "Mrs. Henderson shouldn't have provided that information without proper authorization." But our daughter had anticipated this response as well. The fourth item in her folder was a printout of banking privacy regulations that she had researched with the thoroughness of a law student preparing for trial. "Actually, Dad, banking privacy laws don't prevent employees from explaining general policies about investment products offered by their institution. Mrs. Henderson never discussed specific account details. She simply confirmed that Pinnacle Community Bank doesn't maintain 529 plans internally." The legal precision of Autumn's research revealed how systematically she had approached this investigation. This wasn't the impulsive curiosity of a teenager asking casual questions about college funding. This was the methodical evidence gathering of someone who suspected that lies needed to be exposed through documentation rather than confrontation. "Where is my college fund?" The question came with the quiet authority of someone who already knew the answer but was providing one final opportunity for honesty before revelation of the complete truth. Trevor's silence stretched longer than I had ever experienced in 22 years of marriage. I could hear the clock ticking in his office, the distant sound of morning traffic, and my own heartbeat as I realized that our family was about to fracture in ways that might never be repaired. The money has been redirected temporarily due to some personal financial challenges. I fully intended to replace every dollar before you needed it for college expenses. Autumn's fifth spreadsheet appeared on his desk, and the numbers printed there would complete the destruction of Trevor's credibility while revealing the scope of betrayal that neither of us had imagined possible. I obtained our family credit reports through the free annual reporting services, she announced, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized the level of financial investigation she had conducted. There are gambling gets totaling $89,000 across 6 different casino credit accounts. The most recent charges were made last weekend. The mathematical precision of her evidence was as devastating as the emotional impact of realizing that Trevor had been systematically stealing our daughter's future while lying to both of us about the scope of his addiction and financial deception. The timeline shows that major gambling expenditures correspond exactly with periods when you claimed the college fund was experiencing market fluctuations. You've been stealing my education money to fund gambling losses for approximately 3 years. The moment that transformed our daughter from victim to strategist occurred when Trevor attempted one final manipulation that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Autumn, I know this looks terrible, but gambling addiction is a medical condition, not a moral failing. I've been struggling with this problem, and I need support and understanding from my family, not judgment and confrontation. The appeal to sympathy might have worked on someone who hadn't spent months systematically documenting evidence of deliberate deception. But Autumn had inherited Trevor's analytical mind along with my stubborn refusal to accept treatment that wasn't deserved. Dad, you stole $127,000 from my college fund to pay gambling debts, then lied to both Mom and me about investment performance for 3 years. This isn't about addiction or medical conditions. It's about theft, fraud, and betrayal of trust.
She gathered her spreadsheets and documentation with movements that seemed choreographed for maximum impact. You've taught me that actions have consequences and that financial responsibility requires accountability. I'm going to apply those lessons to this situation. The promise contained in that statement would transform Autumn from victim of her father's theft into the architect of justice that would dismantle Trevor's carefully constructed professional reputation and social standing with the same systematic precision she had used to expose his lies. What happened next would prove that Trevor had drastically underestimated the daughter whose future he had stolen, and that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes not from anger, but from the methodical application of intelligence to the pursuit of accountability. The breaking point had been reached. The battle lines were drawn, and Autumn Montgomery was about to demonstrate that her father's greatest mistake wasn't stealing her college fund, it was assuming she wouldn't have the skills and determination to take back everything he had cost her, with interest. 2 weeks after Autumn's devastating confrontation with Trevor in his home office, our household had settled into an uncomfortable pattern of avoidance and tension. Trevor left for work earlier each morning, stayed late at the bank, and spent his evenings locked in his office making hushed phone calls that invariably ended with the sound of his chair creaking as he slumped forward in defeat. I maintained my nursing schedule at Westfield General Hospital, but found myself unable to concentrate on patient care routines that had become second nature over 15 years of medical practice. Autumn, meanwhile, had transformed into someone I barely recognized. The daughter who had always shared everything with me now moved through our house with the focused determination of someone executing a complex plan that required absolute secrecy. She attended her regular classes at Westfield High School, maintained her work schedule at the veterinary clinic, and completed her college preparation activities with the same methodical precision she had always demonstrated. But there was something different in her demeanor, a calculating quality that reminded me uncomfortably of Trevor during his most successful loan negotiations. The calm before the storm ended on a Thursday morning when Trevor's cell phone began ringing at 6:47 a.m. with the urgent persistence of someone facing a genuine emergency. I was preparing for my early shift at the hospital when I heard him answer with the cautious tone of someone who had been expecting bad news for days. "Trevor Montgomery speaking," he said, and I could hear the tension in his voice even from across our bedroom. The conversation that followed would shatter whatever remained of Trevor's professional composure and reveal that Autumn had been far from idle during those 2 weeks of apparent acceptance of his betrayal. "What do you mean there's an issue with my employment verification?" Trevor's voice carried a strain I had never heard before, the kind of panic that comes from realizing that solid ground is shifting beneath your feet. "I've worked at Pinnacle Community Bank for 15 years. My employment record is impeccable." I paused in my morning routine, recognizing that this phone call represented something far more significant than the routine banking business that typically occupied Trevor's attention. The caller was clearly delivering information that was causing him genuine distress, and his responses suggested that his professional standing was somehow being questioned. "I don't understand how there could be any discrepancy in my personnel file," he continued, his voice rising with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed professional image was being systematically dismantled. "Can you please explain exactly what concerns have been raised about my employment status?" The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to realize that Trevor was receiving information that would fundamentally alter our family's financial security and social standing within the Westfield community where his banking career had provided both income and respectability. "A complaint was filed questioning my handling of client investment advice?" The question came with the shocked disbelief of someone discovering that private actions had become public knowledge in ways that would destroy professional credibility. "What specific allegations are being made and who submitted this complaint?" I could hear Trevor's breathing become rapid and shallow as he struggled to process information that was clearly devastating his assumptions about job security and professional reputation. The man who had spent 15 years building trust relationships with local business owners and establishing himself as Westfield's most reliable loan officer was apparently facing challenges that threatened everything he had worked to achieve. "I need to review these allegations immediately and provide documentation that will resolve any misunderstandings about my professional conduct," he said, attempting to regain control of a situation that was obviously spiraling beyond his ability to manage through explanation or justification. The conversation ended with Trevor promising to arrive at the bank within 30 minutes to meet with human resources representatives and bank executives who would determine whether the allegations warranted disciplinary action or immediate termination. By the time I returned home from my hospital shift that evening, Trevor's professional crisis had expanded into a comprehensive examination of his conduct that revealed the scope of Autumn's strategic planning and her understanding of how institutional accountability systems could be activated to pursue justice for financial crimes.
Trevor was sitting at our kitchen table surrounded by papers, his laptop open to banking regulation websites, and his cell phone buzzing with calls he was no longer answering. The confident loan officer who had left for work that morning had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in days and was struggling to understand how his professional life was being systematically destroyed. "Rachel, I need you to understand what's happening," he said, without looking up from the documents spread across our table. "Someone has filed multiple complaints about my professional conduct with the bank, the State Banking Commission, and the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services." The strategic precision of the complaints suggested coordination by someone who understood exactly which regulatory agencies had authority over different aspects of banking professional conduct and financial advice provision. This wasn't the random anger of someone seeking simple revenge. This was the methodical destruction of professional credibility by someone who had researched the most effective ways to ensure accountability through official channels. The complaints allege that I provided unauthorized investment advice to family members, misrepresented my expertise in financial planning, and engaged in conflicts of interest by managing personal funds through my position at the bank. Trevor continued, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who recognized that the allegations were both accurate and professionally devastating. The documentation accompanying the complaints included copies of conversations Trevor had recorded himself having with various family members and friends about investment strategies, evidence of his claims about managing Autumn's college fund through professional banking relationships, and detailed financial records showing the correlation between his gambling activities and the periods when he had claimed the educational savings were experiencing market difficulties. How could anyone have access to this level of personal financial information? Trevor asked, looking directly at me for the first time since I had entered the kitchen. These complaints include details about our family's private financial arrangements and personal conversations that no outside party should have been able to document. The question answered itself when Autumn walked through our front door carrying her backpack and veterinary clinic work bag, moving with the satisfied composure of someone whose carefully planned strategy was proceeding exactly as anticipated. "Hello, Mom. Hello, Dad," she said, setting her belongings on the counter with movements that seemed choreographed for maximum psychological impact. "I see you've discovered that actions have consequences, and that financial responsibility requires accountability through appropriate regulatory oversight." The satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that our 17-year-old daughter had spent 2 weeks systematically documenting evidence of Trevor's professional misconduct and filing complaints with every agency that had authority to investigate banking employees who violated ethical guidelines and regulatory requirements. Trevor's attempt to minimize the significance of Autumn's regulatory complaints revealed how completely he had underestimated both her intelligence and her determination to pursue justice through official channels that would have lasting consequences for his career and reputation. "Autumn, these complaints could cost me my job and destroy my professional reputation in the banking industry," he said, apparently believing that appealing to her sympathy might convince her to withdraw the allegations before the investigations proceeded to their logical conclusions. "Yes, they could," she replied with the calm authority of someone who had calculated exactly those consequences when designing her strategy for accountability. Professional misconduct should result in professional consequences. That's how regulatory systems protect consumers from unethical financial advice and fraudulent business practices. The strategic precision of her language revealed how thoroughly she had researched banking regulations and professional conduct requirements during those 2 weeks of apparent acceptance of his betrayal. This wasn't impulsive teenage revenge. This was the systematic application of institutional accountability mechanisms by someone who understood exactly how to navigate complex regulatory systems. "You don't understand the banking industry," Trevor said, grasping for any argument that might convince her to halt the investigations that were threatening to destroy everything he had spent 15 years building. "These complaints will be reviewed by people who understand that family financial planning sometimes requires flexibility and creative problem-solving that might appear questionable to outside observers." But Autumn had prepared for this deflection strategy as well, and her response would demonstrate how completely she had researched the professional standards that governed Trevor's career and the consequences for violations of those standards. "Actually, Dad, I understand banking regulation better than you apparently realized," she said, opening her backpack to reveal another folder of documentation that suggested her strategic planning had extended far beyond the initial complaints. "I spent the past 2 weeks studying Oregon banking professional conduct requirements, federal financial advisory regulations, and the specific ethical guidelines that govern employees of FDIC-insured institutions." The documentation contained printed copies of banking regulations that specifically addressed conflicts of interest, unauthorized financial advice, and the requirements for disclosure when bank employees provided investment guidance to personal contacts. The documentation revealed that Trevor had violated multiple professional conduct standards that could result in not only termination from Pinnacle Community Bank, but also prohibition from future employment in the banking industry. These regulations exist specifically to prevent bank employees from exploiting their professional credibility to provide unauthorized financial advice or to misrepresent their qualifications when managing other people's money. Autumn continued, consulting her notes with the precision of someone presenting evidence in a regulatory hearing.
The investigation that had begun with complaints about Trevor's professional conduct would soon expand to include examination of his gambling activities, his misuse of family funds, and his systematic deception about investment performance that had continued for 3 years while he stole money designated for his daughter's educational expenses. By Friday afternoon, the scope of Autumn's strategic revenge had extended beyond regulatory complaints to include community accountability measures that would ensure Trevor's financial crimes became public knowledge within the social networks where his reputation had previously provided credibility and respect. Mrs. Patterson, Autumn's high school counselor, called our house to discuss irregularities in family financial documentation that had been discovered during routine verification of college financial aid applications. The conversation revealed that Autumn had proactively contacted the school's college planning office to report discrepancies in family financial information that might affect her eligibility for need-based assistance programs. I wanted to ensure complete accuracy in my college funding applications, Autumn had explained to Mrs. Patterson, according to the conversation Trevor recounted to me with growing panic. My family's financial situation has changed significantly due to my father's gambling debts and mismanagement of designated educational funds. The disclosure meant that Autumn's college counselor, the high school administration, and potentially other families involved in college planning discussions would become aware that Trevor's financial advice and professional credibility had been based on lies that included stealing his daughter's education money to fund gambling losses. The social consequences of this community disclosure would prove as devastating as the professional regulatory investigations because Trevor's standing within Westfield's social networks had been built on his reputation as the responsible family man whose banking expertise made him a trusted source of financial guidance for neighbors and friends. The crisis that had begun with regulatory complaints about professional misconduct was expanding into comprehensive destruction of Trevor's credibility within every community where his reputation had previously provided social capital and business relationships. Autumn's strategy was revealing itself as far more sophisticated than simple revenge. This was the systematic dismantling of her father's ability to continue exploiting trust relationships for personal benefit while avoiding accountability for the consequences of his deceptive and destructive behavior. The daughter whose college fund he had stolen was ensuring that he would face the full cost of his choices through every institution and social network that had the power to hold him accountable for violating the trust that had made his professional and personal deceptions possible. The weekend following Trevor's professional crisis brought a parade of family members and friends who had apparently been recruited to convince Autumn that her systematic destruction of her father's reputation was excessive punishment for what they characterized as a temporary lapse in judgment caused by medical addiction rather than deliberate criminal behavior. Saturday morning arrived with the sound of my sister Jennifer's Honda Civic pulling into our driveway at precisely 8:30 a.m., followed by the purposeful footsteps of someone who had been appointed family spokesperson for addressing what she undoubtedly viewed as a teenager's disproportionate response to adult financial complications. Jennifer had driven 3 hours from Portland specifically to deliver what she considered mature perspective about family forgiveness and the importance of supporting relatives through difficult personal challenges. Her approach to family crisis management had always involved minimizing problems through emotional appeals, rather than addressing underlying issues through accountability measures. "Autumn, honey, I know you're angry about this college fund situation," she began, settling into our living room with the confident authority of someone who believed that adult wisdom would naturally override teenage emotional reactions. "But you need to understand that addiction is a disease, not a choice. Your father needs treatment and support from his family, not punishment that could destroy his ability to rebuild his life." The intervention strategy revealed how completely Trevor's extended family misunderstood both the scope of his deception and the calculated nature of Autumn's response. They viewed her regulatory complaints and community disclosures as impulsive revenge rather than strategic justice pursued through appropriate institutional channels.
Autumn listened to Jennifer's prepared speech about addiction compassion with the patient attention of someone who had anticipated this manipulation tactic and developed comprehensive counter-arguments based on factual analysis rather than emotional appeals. "Aunt Jennifer, I appreciate your concern about Dad's gambling addiction," she replied with a composure that seemed startling in someone who had just turned 18. "However, addiction doesn't excuse theft, fraud, or systematic deception that continued for 3 years while he lied to both Mom and me about the status of money designated for my education." The legal precision of her language revealed how thoroughly she had researched the distinction between medical conditions and criminal behavior during her strategic planning process. This wasn't the emotional reactivity Jennifer had expected from a teenager facing family crisis. This was the methodical application of ethical standards by someone who understood that consequences should correspond to choices rather than circumstances. "Aunt Jennifer, you're being very harsh towards someone who raised you and provided for your family for 18 years. Trevor made some mistakes, but he doesn't deserve to lose his career and his reputation over temporary problems that can be resolved through counseling and family support."
But Autumn had prepared for this deflection strategy as well, and her response would demonstrate how completely she had documented the impact of Trevor's temporary problems on her educational future and our family's financial security. "Aunt Jennifer, Dad didn't make some mistakes," she said, opening yet another folder of documentation that revealed the comprehensive scope of her evidence-gathering activities. "He committed systematic theft totaling $127,000 over 3 years, then constructed elaborate lies about investment performance to cover up his crimes while I trusted him to manage my college fund responsibly." The mathematical precision of her documentation included detailed calculations showing how Trevor's gambling losses had directly corresponded to periods when the college fund should have been experiencing growth, creating a clear pattern of theft rather than poor investment decisions or market fluctuations. "These aren't temporary problems, Aunt Jennifer. This is a pattern of criminal behavior that has destroyed my educational opportunities while he maintained his reputation as a trustworthy banking professional who could provide reliable financial advice to family members and community members." Sunday afternoon brought Dr. Marcus Henley, the family counselor Trevor's employer had recommended for addressing gambling addiction through therapeutic intervention, rather than punitive measures that could exacerbate underlying psychological conditions driving destructive behavior patterns. Dr. Henley's approach emphasized family healing through understanding, forgiveness, and collaborative support for recovery, rather than accountability measures that might prevent Trevor from accessing the employment stability necessary for repaying stolen funds and rebuilding trust relationships. "Autumn, I understand you're experiencing feelings of betrayal and anger about your father's financial decisions," Dr. Henley began, with the practiced authority of someone who had spent years helping families navigate addiction-related crises. "These emotions are completely natural and valid. However, punitive responses often prevent addicts from accessing the resources and support systems they need for successful recovery." The therapeutic framework he presented positioned Autumn's regulatory complaints as barriers to family healing, rather than appropriate accountability measures for financial crimes that had destroyed her educational planning and violated professional ethical standards. "Your father has acknowledged his gambling problem and expressed genuine remorse about the impact his addiction has had on your college fund," Dr. Henley continued, apparently believing that admission of wrongdoing should automatically result in forgiveness and cessation of consequences. "The most constructive approach would be to withdraw the professional complaints that are preventing him from maintaining the employment necessary for making financial restitution and rebuilding trust relations." But Autumn had researched addiction recovery principles as thoroughly as she had studied banking regulations, and her understanding of therapeutic accountability contradicted Dr. Henley's recommendation for minimizing consequences through family accommodation. "Dr. Henley, I've read extensively about gambling addiction recovery during the past month," she said, producing another folder of research materials that demonstrated her systematic approach to understanding every aspect of the situation she was addressing.
Effective treatment requires addicts to face the full consequences of their behavior rather than being protected from accountability through family enabling. The research she had compiled included studies showing that gambling addicts who avoided professional and legal consequences for their destructive behavior were significantly more likely to relapse than those who faced comprehensive accountability for their actions. Dad hasn't just acknowledged his gambling problem, he's acknowledged systematic theft, fraud, and professional misconduct that violated his ethical obligations as a banking employee and his parental responsibilities as my college fund manager. Monday evening brought the most sophisticated intervention attempt, orchestrated by several Westfield community leaders who had apparently concluded that Autumn's actions were threatening the social stability that depended on maintaining trust in local financial institutions and the professionals who managed them. Patricia Walsh, president of the Westfield Chamber of Commerce, arrived with Robert Chen, who served on the city council and maintained business relations with Pinnacle Community Bank for municipal financial services. Their approach emphasized community responsibility and the importance of resolving family conflicts through private mediation rather than public accountability measures that could damage local business confidence. Autumn, we understand you're experiencing feelings of betrayal and anger about your father's financial decisions, Patricia began, with the diplomatic tone she used for managing conflicts between local businesses and community organizations. However, your complaints against your father are creating concerns about Pinnacle Community Bank's stability and reliability that could affect the entire local economy. The community intervention strategy positioned Autumn's pursuit of justice as potentially harmful to broader social and economic interests that extended beyond her family's internal conflicts. This approach attempted to leverage civic responsibility and community loyalty to convince her that personal accountability should be subordinated to collective economic welfare. Trevor has been a respected member of our business community for 15 years, Robert added, with the authority of someone who had worked with Trevor on multiple municipal financial planning projects. His banking expertise has contributed to significant economic development initiatives that have benefited everyone in Westfield. These regulatory investigations could undermine confidence in our local financial institutions. But Autumn had anticipated this appeal to community loyalty as well, and her response revealed how thoroughly she understood the relationship between individual accountability and institutional trustworthiness.
Mr. Chen, Miss Walsh, I appreciate your concern about community economic stability, she said, with a maturity that seemed remarkable in someone whose 18th birthday had occurred just weeks earlier. However, protecting financial professionals who commit theft and fraud actually undermines institutional trustworthiness rather than preserving it. Her analysis of community banking stability included research showing that public accountability for professional misconduct increases consumer confidence and regulatory oversight, rather than damaging trust in financial institutions that maintain ethical standards. Dad used his position at Pinnacle Community Bank to establish credibility for providing unauthorized investment advice and managing personal funds without appropriate disclosure or oversight. She continued, consulting documentation that revealed how extensively she had researched the ethical foundations of community banking relationships. If the community protects him from accountability for these violations, it sends the message that banking professionals can exploit their institutional credibility for personal benefit without facing consequences through appropriate regulatory channels. Tuesday brought Trevor's final attempt to halt Autumn's systematic destruction of his professional and personal reputation through the most manipulative strategy he could devise: threatening to destroy our family's remaining financial stability through actions that would punish both Autumn and me for her refusal to withdraw her complaints. Autumn, I need you to understand the full consequences of your actions, he said, during what he characterized as a final opportunity for family reconciliation before irreversible damage occurred to relationships and resources we all depended upon for security and stability.
If these regulatory investigations continue, I will lose my job at Pinnacle Community Bank, which means I will be unable to make mortgage payments, maintain our health insurance, or provide any financial support for your college expenses. He continued with the calculated delivery of someone using economic coercion to achieve compliance with his demands. The threat revealed how completely Trevor misunderstood both Autumn's strategic thinking and her commitment to justice, regardless of personal costs. He apparently believed that threatening additional financial hardship would convince her to prioritize family economic stability over accountability for his criminal behavior. If you care about your mother's financial security and your own educational future, you will withdraw these complaints immediately and allow us to address this situation privately through family counseling and debt repayment arrangements. He concluded with the expectation that economic leverage would prove more effective than the emotional appeals that had already failed. But Autumn's response would demonstrate that she had calculated these consequences more thoroughly than Trevor realized, and that her strategic planning had included preparations for exactly this type of manipulative retaliation. The intervention attempts had revealed the extent to which Trevor's family, professional counselor, and community supporters misunderstood both the scope of his misconduct and the sophistication of Autumn's pursuit of justice through appropriate institutional channels. Their efforts to minimize consequences through emotional manipulation, therapeutic deflection, and economic coercion would prove ineffective against someone who had spent months researching the most effective ways to ensure that financial crimes resulted in appropriate accountability regardless of social pressure or family loyalty concerns. Wednesday morning brought the phone call that would validate every aspect of Autumn's strategic planning and demonstrate that her systematic approach to accountability had achieved exactly the consequences she had calculated when designing her comprehensive response to Trevor's theft and deception. Margaret Foster from the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services called our house at 9:15 a.m. to inform Trevor that the investigation into his professional conduct had been completed and that the findings would result in immediate suspension of his banking license, pending a formal hearing to determine whether permanent revocation was appropriate. Mr. Montgomery, our investigation has confirmed violations of professional conduct standards, including unauthorized financial advisory services, conflicts of interest in personal fund management, and misrepresentation of institutional investment capabilities. She explained with the methodical precision of someone delivering conclusions based on comprehensive regulatory review. Trevor's hands were shaking as he listened to the formal findings that would end his 15-year banking career and eliminate any possibility of future employment in financial services. The professional credibility he had spent decades building had been systematically dismantled through documentation that revealed the scope of his misconduct and the deliberate nature of his deception. The evidence submitted in the complaints included recordings of conversations where you claimed professional expertise in investment management through Pinnacle Community Bank partnerships that do not exist, detailed financial records showing correlation between personal gambling activities and misrepresentation of client fund performance, and testimony from family members who relied on your professional reputation when making educational investment decisions. The regulatory findings validated every aspect of Autumn's research and documentation while confirming that her pursuit of accountability through official channels had resulted in appropriate consequences for Trevor's systematic violation of professional ethical standards. Thursday brought notification from Pinnacle Community Bank that Trevor's employment had been terminated effective immediately and that his pension benefits would be frozen pending resolution of potential civil liability for professional misconduct that had damaged the bank's reputation and potentially exposed the institution to regulatory penalties. The termination letter, which Trevor read aloud, with the defeated tone of someone whose assumptions about job security had been completely shattered, revealed that Autumn's complaints had triggered internal investigations that uncovered additional violations of bank policies regarding employee conduct and client relationship management. Mr. Montgomery, your unauthorized provision of investment advice using institutional credentials, your misrepresentation of bank services to personal contacts, and your failure to disclose conflicts of interest have created liability concerns that require immediate termination to protect the bank's regulatory standing and professional reputation, the letter stated, with corporate language designed to document legal justification for ending his career. But the most devastating revelation came Friday afternoon when Autumn presented Trevor with comprehensive financial analysis that demonstrated how her strategic planning had extended far beyond regulatory complaints to include civil recovery actions that would ensure complete restitution for the stolen college funds, with additional penalties that reflected the true cost of his deception. Dad, I filed a civil lawsuit against you for theft of designated educational funds, fraud in the management of trust assets, and intentional infliction of emotional distress through systematic deception about my college financing, she announced with the same calm precision she had demonstrated throughout her pursuit of justice. The legal documentation she presented revealed that she had retained an attorney specializing in family financial fraud and that her case included evidence sufficient to secure judgment for not only the $127,000 in stolen principal, but also lost investment returns, additional educational costs resulting from delayed enrollment, and punitive damages for the deliberate nature of his misconduct. My attorney has explained that gambling debts cannot be discharged in bankruptcy proceedings, which means you will be legally obligated to repay every dollar, regardless of your employment status or future financial circumstances, she continued, consulting legal briefs that demonstrated her thorough understanding of debt collection procedures and asset recovery mechanisms. The civil lawsuit represented the final component of Autumn's comprehensive strategy for ensuring that Trevor would face complete accountability for his choices while she recovered the resources necessary to pursue her educational goals despite his theft of her college fund. The weekend brought confirmation that Autumn's pursuit of accountability had achieved consequences extending far beyond Trevor's individual punishment to include community-wide recognition that financial professionals who violate trust relationships would face comprehensive accountability through multiple institutional channels. Saturday's edition of the Westfield Gazette included a front-page article about regulatory violations at Pinnacle Community Bank that resulted in employee termination and raised questions about oversight procedures for preventing unauthorized financial advisory services that exploit institutional credibility for personal benefit. The article, which quoted extensively from State Banking Commission findings, served as public validation of Autumn's complaints while educating the community about professional conduct standards that protect consumers from exploitation by financial services employees who misrepresent their qualifications or institutional authority. The investigation revealed systematic violations of professional conduct standards, including unauthorized investment advice, misrepresentation of institutional services, and conflicts of interest in personal fund management that continued for approximately 3 years, the article stated, providing specific details that confirmed the accuracy of Autumn's documentation and the appropriateness of her regulatory complaints. The community response to this public accountability demonstrated how Autumn's strategy had transformed individual justice into broader institutional protection by exposing conduct that could have affected other families if it had remained hidden through private accommodation rather than official accountability. Sunday brought personal acknowledgments from community members who expressed appreciation for Autumn's courage in pursuing accountability through appropriate channels rather than accepting private resolution that would have allowed similar misconduct to continue affecting other families. Mrs. Henderson from Pinnacle Community Bank's Investment Services Department called to thank Autumn for exposing misrepresentation of bank services that could have created legal liability for the institution if clients had relied on unauthorized advice provided by employees who lacked appropriate qualifications and oversight.
Your complaints protected both our bank's reputation and our client's financial security by ensuring that professional conduct violations were addressed through proper regulatory channels, she explained, validating Autumn's decision to pursue institutional accountability rather than family accommodation. Monday morning brought the phone call that represented the ultimate validation of Autumn's strategic planning and her refusal to accept inadequate consequences for Trevor's theft of her educational future. Oregon State University's Financial Aid Office called to inform Autumn that her civil lawsuit against Trevor, combined with documentation of family financial fraud, had qualified her for additional need-based assistance that would cover educational expenses beyond her academic scholarships. Ms. Montgomery, your documentation of family financial crimes and your proactive legal action to recover stolen educational funds demonstrates exactly the kind of personal responsibility and strategic thinking that our university values in students, the financial aid counselor explained. The university's response included not only increased financial assistance, but also recognition of Autumn's research and documentation skills through an offer to participate in a special honors program for students demonstrating exceptional analytical abilities and ethical reasoning in challenging circumstances. Tuesday brought confirmation that Autumn's attorney had secured a preliminary injunction freezing Trevor's remaining assets to ensure availability for restitution payments, and that the civil lawsuit was proceeding on an expedited timeline that would result in judgment within 60 days. The legal proceedings included testimony from banking experts who confirmed that Trevor's misrepresentation of professional expertise and institutional authority constituted fraud that warranted maximum damages for the systematic nature of his deception and the impact on Autumn's educational planning. Wednesday morning brought the final piece of Autumn's comprehensive victory when the court-appointed financial analyst presented findings showing that Trevor's gambling losses totaled $156,000 over 3 years, meaning that the college fund theft represented only a portion of his destructive behavior that had been funded through systematic deception about family financial management.
The resolution of Autumn's pursuit of justice had transformed not only the immediate consequences for Trevor's misconduct, but also the long-term dynamics of accountability and trust within our family and community relationships. Trevor's comprehensive loss of professional credibility, employment security, and financial assets had been achieved through Autumn's systematic application of institutional accountability mechanisms rather than emotional revenge or family accommodation that would have minimized consequences while enabling continued destructive behavior. The civil judgment requiring full restitution of stolen funds plus damages ensured that Autumn's educational goals would be achieved despite Trevor's theft, while the regulatory findings and community accountability created lasting consequences that would prevent similar exploitation of professional trust relationships. Most importantly, Autumn had demonstrated that strategic thinking and institutional accountability could achieve justice more effectively than emotional reactions or family loyalty that prioritized maintaining relationships over addressing harmful behavior through appropriate consequences. Her transformation from victim of financial crime to architect of comprehensive accountability had proven that systematic planning and professional execution could overcome even the most sophisticated deception by someone who had exploited family trust and professional credibility for personal benefit. The daughter whose college fund had been stolen to pay gambling debts had recovered not only her educational resources, but also her power to ensure that actions have consequences, and that trust, once violated through systematic deception, must be rebuilt through demonstrated accountability rather than promised reform. Trevor's assumption that family loyalty would protect him from the consequences of financial crimes had been shattered by a daughter who understood that genuine love sometimes requires holding people accountable for their choices, rather than enabling their destructive behavior through accommodation and forgiveness that prevents meaningful change.
The lesson that emerged from Autumn's brilliant revenge was that strategic thinking, institutional accountability, and systematic documentation could achieve justice more effectively than anger, confrontation, or family accommodation in situations where trust had been systematically violated through deliberate deception and criminal behavior. Sometimes the most effective response to betrayal is not emotional reaction, but calculated application of accountability mechanisms that ensure appropriate consequences, while protecting others from similar exploitation through institutional transparency and professional accountability. Two incredible stories are waiting for you right below. If this one grabbed your attention, these next ones will too. Click to dive in.